The Hoh River runs cold and dark through the western slope of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state, cutting a path through a forest so dense that noon in July arrives at the forest floor as a kind of pewter dusk. Sitka spruce trees 90 feet in circumference stand, wrapped in curtains of club moss. Western red cedars older than European settlement push their roots through a forest floor, made not of soil, but of 6 inches of accumulated organic matter. Wet year-round, soft underfoot, silent in a way that absorbs sound rather than reflecting it. This is not wilderness in the scenic calendar sense, with its clean light and its cooperative distances. It is wilderness in the older meaning, the kind that requires no explanation and offers none. In the winter of 2021, a wildlife field technician working for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife pulled a memory card from a trail camera mounted to a red cedar along a game trail in the Upper Hoh drainage. Standard predator monitoring procedure. Waterproof housing. Infrared motion sensor, the kind of placement that produces images of Roosevelt elk moving between river terraces in the dark, or a black bear stepping over a moss-covered log at 3 in the morning. Routine work in an unroutine place. The card held 112 trigger events across 4 consecutive nights. More than 25 activations per night, through the deepest part of winter, in an area where the elk herds had descended to lower elevations and the black bear population was largely in their dens. Of those 112 triggers, 73 produced usable images, and of those 73 images, no one on the monitoring team could definitively identify what they were looking at. The images were not corrupted. The camera had not malfunctioned. Whatever moved through that section of old-growth forest moved in a way that did not match the documented movement signature of any species the team had previously recorded in this drainage. Low, deliberate, covering ground with a purposefulness that did not fit the behavioral profile of anything that was supposed to be there. It would have meant nothing, except that it was not the only camera. The Olympic Peninsula is one of the most consistently monitored wilderness areas on the Pacific coast of North America. The Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Olympic National Park's own research division, and rotating university field teams have been deploying trail cameras across the peninsula's major river drainages for more than 2 decades. The Hoh, the Queets, the Quinault, the Elwha. These corridors are the main arteries through which large animals move across the peninsula's interior, and they have been surveyed with a level of attention that researchers in less accessible wilderness areas would consider exceptional, which is what makes the accumulation of anomalous triggers worth paying attention to. Between 2019 and 2023, wildlife monitoring programs across the Olympic Peninsula documented a consistent pattern of camera activations that did not correlate with documented animal movements. Not in a way that generated alarm or headlines, in a quiet, methodical way that field technicians noted in survey logs and that researchers flagged for review without always arriving at resolution. Cameras in the Upper Hoh Valley triggered at frequencies inconsistent with local deer and elk density during winter monitoring windows. A camera network in the Quinault drainage produced a sequence of activations that covered 11 miles of monitored corridor in a time frame that the survey notes described as atypical for documented resident species. Something was moving through the Olympic Peninsula's river corridors in patterns that exceeded what the known fauna should produce. At 4,700 feet elevation on the north slope of the Hoh drainage in late November of 2022, a monitoring camera triggered 17 times in a 2.5-hour window beginning at 2 in the morning. GP's collar data placed all known resident cougars in that monitoring zone at different locations. The elk herds had gone. The bears were denning in the cedars. The field technician who pulled the card described the movement signature in a single word in her log. Purposeful, 1 anomalous trigger is a malfunction. 7 are a pattern. When researchers began cross-referencing unexplained activations across the full monitoring network, the number was not 7. Before going further, it is worth being precise about what the Olympic Peninsula officially contains. and what it officially does not. Olympic National Park covers 922,000 acres of protected wilderness. Its wildlife inventory is among the most thoroughly documented of any national park in the Pacific Northwest. Roosevelt's elk, the largest subspecies of elk in North America, move through the Hoh and Queets valleys in herds of dozens, their antlers catching the infrared light of monitoring cameras in November. Black bears number between 900 and 1,200 individuals across the park and surrounding national forest. Olympic marmots, a subspecies found nowhere else on the planet, colonize the subalpine meadows above the old growth zone. Black-tailed deer move through the lowland fern corridors. And cougars. The Olympic Cougar Project, affiliated with Washington State University's Wildlife Research Division, has been tracking mountain lion movements across the peninsula since 2009, deploying GPS collars, hair snare stations, and trail cameras across the park's major drainages. The project's data suggests the park supports somewhere between 20 and 40 resident cougars, a density consistent with the elk biomass that sustains them. Their home ranges are mapped. Their seasonal movements are understood. When an unexplained camera trigger occurs in cougar country, the first question is straightforward. Where were the collared animals at the time of the activation? In the cases flagged as unexplained, the collared cougars were not the source of the trigger. The known population, in the monitoring team's own assessment, does not account for the frequency and distribution of what the camera network has been recording. Which brings the conversation to an animal that, according to the official record, should not be on the Olympic Peninsula at all. The gray wolf, Canis lupus, was systematically eliminated from the Olympic Peninsula by the 1920s. Bounty programs, trapping campaigns, and the progressive clearing of lowland forest eliminated the resident wolf population before the Great Depression. The peninsula spent the better part of a century as one of the few large wilderness complexes in the lower 48 states with no established wolf presence. Officially, none, an apex predator slot that had been empty for nearly 100 years. In October of 2021, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife confirmed, through DNA analysis of scat collected from the Hoh River Valley, that at least 2 gray wolves were present on the Olympic Peninsula. They designated the animals the Hoh Pack. And then, with the careful language of a wildlife agency that understands the implications of what it is saying, they noted that the full extent of wolf activity on the peninsula remained not yet determined. If you look at a topographic map of Washington state, the Olympic Peninsula's geography tells its own story about why this confirmation surprised almost everyone. To the north, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, roughly 12 miles of cold and current-driven saltwater, separates the peninsula from Vancouver Island. To the east, Hood Canal, a glacially carved fjord, runs the length of the peninsula's eastern margin, narrowing at its northern end to a crossing of roughly 2 miles near the community of Belfair. South of that, Puget Sound extends further east, completing a 3-sided water barrier around a landmass the size of a small country. The peninsula connects to the mainland by one fixed road bridge. In practical terms, it is almost an island. For a dispersing wolf to reach the Olympic Peninsula from any established wolf territory, it faces either an overland route traversing multiple highway corridors and suburban edges before arriving at the waterway boundary, or the waterway itself. The nearest established wolf populations are in the North Cascades, several hundred miles northeast by overland distance. But wolves swim. This is not a theoretical claim. Wolves on Isle Royale in Lake Superior reach their island home by crossing open freshwater distances documented in multiple studies at 10 to 15 miles. Wolves along the British Columbia coast regularly move between the mainland and nearshore islands as part of normal ranging behavior, navigating multi-mile open water crossings without apparent difficulty. The Hood Canal narrows to approximately 2 miles at its northern crossing point near the bridge. That is a demanding swim in cold water. It is not an impossible one. Genetic analysis of the Hoh Pack's DNA profile estimated the animal's lineage was consistent with North Cascades wolf genetics, suggesting a dispersal event rather than a remnant population that had somehow persisted undetected through a century of monitoring. An animal, or animals, had crossed, and if they crossed, the question that the trail camera data quietly raises is whether 2 is the accurate count or the documented minimum. If you have made it this far, subscribe. This channel covers the cases that wildlife science has not yet closed. And the Olympic Peninsula may be one of the most genuinely open questions in North American ecology at this moment. What a wolf can do inside a temperate rainforest ecosystem is a question that wildlife biology has addressed mostly through indirect evidence, because no established wolf pack has inhabited a Pacific Northwest temperate rainforest in modern times with sustained monitoring. The research foundation comes from Yellowstone, from the boundary waters of Minnesota, from Scandinavia and coastal British Columbia. Applying those findings to the whole rainforest requires extrapolation. But the extrapolation holds. In Yellowstone, individual dispersing wolves have been documented traveling more than 40 miles in a single day. In the North Cascades, monitored packs maintain home ranges that can exceed several hundred square miles per animal across rugged mountain terrain. The Olympic Peninsula's Roosevelt elk herds represent, by the prey biomass standards that wolf biologists use to assess habitat quality, an exceptional resource. Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife habitat assessments for wolf range recovery across Washington state identify the Olympic Peninsula as high-priority potential habitat, driven by its elk density, the absence of human hunting pressure within national park boundaries, and the extensive intact forest corridors connecting the peninsula's major drainages. The prey is there. The territory exists. The forest cover is as complete as anywhere in the lower 48 states. And the forest is dense enough that a small number of wolves, moving primarily at night through old-growth drainages away from the valley floor roads, could establish a presence that an under-resourced monitoring network would register as anomalous triggers long before it registered as a pack. A wolf in deep old-growth temperate rainforest, moving at the margin of an infrared camera's effective range, produces an image that is, at best, ambiguous. At worst, it produces exactly the kind of image that has been accumulating in the monitoring network's flagged files for the past several years. A large shape, low and horizontal, moving with intent through sword ferns and across the tangle of nurse logs, briefly at the edge of the frame, and then gone into the dark of the drainage. The history of wildlife biology contains a recurring pattern that is worth naming before going further. It is the pattern of official absences that turned out to be monitoring failures. The coelacanth was considered extinct for 65 million years until a South African museum curator encountered one in a fishing market in 1938. The fishermen who occasionally landed them had not known they were remarkable. Nobody had thought to ask. The black-footed ferret was officially declared extinct after exhaustive surveys in 1979 and was rediscovered 2 years later when a ranch dog near Meteets, Wyoming, dragged a dead specimen onto a porch. An entire species recovery program, which has since grown to involve captive breeding facilities and multi-state reintroduction efforts, began with that single carcass brought to the door. Closer to the question at hand, the recolonization of the northeastern United States by the eastern coyote offers an instructive parallel. Through the first half of the 20th century, wildlife managers were confident that coyotes were not viable residents of New England. The habitat was wrong. The human population density was too high. The distance from established coyote range was too great. By the 1980s, coyotes had not only colonized every northeastern state, but had interbred with remnant Great Lakes wolf genetics to produce a larger and more ecologically complex animal that now occupies every county from Maine to Virginia. They accomplished this, as biologists later reconstructed through retrospective survey data, almost entirely without being documented as a spreading population until they were already embedded in their new range. The Olympic Peninsula presents a geographically bounded version of that possibility, an isolated wilderness with exceptional prey resources and a century of official absence for its apex candidate, 2 individuals confirmed in 2021. The question of how long those individuals or animals that preceded them had been present before the scat genetics returned from the laboratory is one that the WDFW's own communications do not answer. The trail cameras had been triggering in the interim. The field notebooks had been filling with flagged entries. The official designation, until the genetics analysis was complete, was that the anomalous triggers were simply unexplained. Honesty requires saying plainly what the skeptics get right. The Olympic Peninsula's monitoring infrastructure, while extensive by wilderness standards, is not a comprehensive surveillance system. It is a sample. The distinction matters considerably when evaluating what the data can and cannot tell us. Olympic National Park alone covers more than 900,000 acres of roadless wilderness. The national forest lands buffering the park add millions more acres of complex terrain, much of it receiving no systematic camera coverage at all. Placements along game trails and river crossings represent a fraction of the animal movement occurring across that landscape at any given time. A researcher reviewing the monitoring network, without having walked the upper drainages in November, might conclude it is thorough. A researcher who has made that walk would not make that mistake. The answer to the reasonable skeptic, the one who asks why, if something unusual is present in meaningful numbers, no clear photograph has emerged, comes in 3 parts. Not one of those parts requires the animal to be absent. Coverage is the first part. The Olympic Peninsula's most remote terrain, the Upper Queets drainage, the Inner Quinault headwaters, the sections of the Hoh above the research station and visitor infrastructure, requires multi-day backcountry travel in summer and is largely inaccessible in winter without specialized cold weather expedition equipment. An animal moving through that interior, even repeatedly and over an extended period, could trigger no cameras at all while remaining well within its home range. And a wolf, which is a cognitively sophisticated predator that learns its landscape with precision, tends to treat novel objects in familiar territory with wariness. Remote cameras in wolf-occupied areas in other regions have been documented going weeks before a newly arrived wolf approaches them closely enough to produce a clear image. Classification is the second part. When a camera image returns unclear, the standard workflow in an active survey is not deep investigation. It is dismissal. Images that cannot be conclusively identified are logged as non-target triggers and moved to a review queue that, in an understaffed monitoring program spread across hundreds of miles of wilderness, may sit unexamined for weeks or months. The logic this produces is worth naming directly. We cannot confirm in an area what we are not actively looking for in that area. The absence of confirmed documentation does not mean the documentation was examined and found absent. It means the process that would generate documentation has not been systematically applied. Preservation is the third part. The Hoh rainforest receives more than 140 inches of precipitation per year in the wettest areas near the park boundary. The forest floor, a deep mat of saturated moss and decomposing wood and accumulated organic material, does not hold physical evidence the way an arid or cold, dry environment does. A wolf carcass in the Sonoran Desert might remain identifiable for months. In the Hoh rainforest, a body of comparable size would be biologically dismantled, fur and bone and all, in a matter of weeks under warmer conditions, leaving no surface trace. The reason there are no recoverable bodies is not necessarily the reason the skeptic assumes. In this forest, the reason there are no bodies is the forest itself. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is, in the Hoh rainforest, simply what happens to everything that dies there. So we return to where we started. A trail camera mounted to a western red cedar in the upper Hoh drainage, in the middle of winter, in an area where the cataloged fauna should have left the sensor quiet. 112 activations. 73 images. Nothing definitively named. The Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife's communications on wolf activity in the Olympic Peninsula acknowledge confirmed presence, active monitoring, and a status they describe with the phrase "not yet determined." Those 3 words carry considerable weight. They describe a wildlife situation that has moved past the threshold of pure speculation, but has not yet arrived at the kind of documented certainty that triggers formal management responses and changes official public communications about what lives where. This is the space the entire question occupies. Not confirmed at full scale. Not dismissed. A monitoring network registering something it cannot fully explain. In a forest documented to hold things that official surveys did not expect to find. In an ecosystem where the conditions for an apex predator to exist undetected are as close to favorable as anywhere in the continental United States. If you have driven the road into the Hoh Rainforest, past the old growth corridor where moss hangs from big leaf maples and curtains that reach toward the forest floor, and the light disappears before it reaches the ground, you may have experienced the feeling that something in the shadows beyond the tree line was watching you. The Park Service attributes that feeling to the enclosed nature of the canopy and the unusual acoustic properties of the understory. But somewhere in the roadless interior of that forest, away from the visitor center and the campgrounds and the interpretive trails, trail cameras keep triggering in the dark. Field notebooks keep filling with entries that flag and circle and reach no conclusion. And whatever has been moving through the old growth in the small hours of winter mornings, low and deliberate, covering the ground between river drainages with a purpose that the monitoring record cannot yet name, keeps moving. The forest is 900,000 acres. The cameras are a sample. Whatever is out there has more territory than any current monitoring effort can account for. The question is not whether the evidence exists. The question is whether, if it does, we would know.